Will actually be the opposite. This is me taking an extremely simple idea and making it way too complex. So, I used to live in downtown Los Angeles, and the apartment that I chose, I moved into specifically because right across the street was a millinery and the hat maker. And I went in one day and I asked the woman if she could make the impossible hat from Madame Bovary. So if you don't know what I mean by that, here's the exact quote. Quote, "It was one of those composite hats where you find traces of the bearskin, shako, derby, sealskin cap, and cotton nightcap. In short, one of those wretched things whose dumb ugliness has depths of expression like an imbecile's face. Oval, stiffened with whalebone, it began with 3 round lumps, then alternating lozenge-shaped passages of velvet and rabbit skins separated by a red band. After that came a sort of bag that ended in a cardboard polygon covered with complicated braiding, from which hung at the end of a long thin cord small twisted gold threads in the form of a tassel. The cap was new, its peak shone." So this milliner, when I walked in, she refused to make the hat. And not because it was too difficult, but she said because each of the ingredients are different now than they were in the 18th century when Flaubert wrote that passage. Velvet, rabbit skin, whalebone, tassels, imbeciles, cotton, all of it are different now. It's an impossible hat, not because of its spatial or aesthetic configurations, but because time makes such translation impossible. Nearby, over in the Garment District in downtown LA, right on the border of Skid Row, past the new virtual reality arcade and people searching their phones for the emoji juste, tucked between half a dozen sliding steel doors, there's a small business called the Rage Ground. So in the Rage Ground, you walk in and you're given a sledgehammer, a shovel, or a baseball bat, you get to choose, and you can destroy, depending on your mood, large things. For example, they'll fill the room with tables, desks, computers, or small things, for example, teacups, pictures, cassette tapes, or perhaps symbolic things, for example, teacups, pictures, cassette tapes. The clientele, according to one of the business's co-owners, who's a 23-year-old man who studies anthropology at the nearby Santa Monica College, and whose mother is a psychiatrist, is 75% female. In the 1874 Etiquette Guide, a manual of etiquette with hints on politeness and good breeding, girls are told of Cordelia from King Lear, quote, "Her voice was ever sweet, gentle and low, an excellent thing in woman." In a section titled Wives, restraint is made even more explicit. Quote, "Domestic troubles will arise and domestic storms may sweep over the home, but the cheerful wife will possess the power to rise above them all, and a quiet, meek, submissive spirit will bring her to safe harbor. But if you can learn to possess complete command over your own temper, you will be able to decrease the strength of your husband's temper. Govern yourself, and then you will learn how to govern others." In other words, to be restrained is to be in control of one's emotions. One must not boil over. Rage Ground, with its 75% female clientele, can be thought of in this context as a place to go to be inelegant in private. So this talk is kind of also the reverse, where this is actually a draft of a New Yorker piece that I'm now turning into a talk. So I went and I interviewed the people that own this place, this Rage Ground, and people as they came out. So when I spoke to a group of 5 women after they had spent half an hour in the Rage Room, it was clear something more was at stake. Said one woman, who I'll call Pyro, for reasons that will be obvious later, quote, "I can see a social aspect of it. We're not supposed to be aggressive." Another one, quote, "Right, we're supposed to be so cool, calm, and collected, demure almost, and we don't get to voice our opinions all the time. And there's so many times where we just rise above and don't say anything. And then this room is an outlet to let all that go." Another, "Yeah, in the workplace, when guys get mad or angry, it's just like, oh, he's whatever, he's being a boss, or he's just doing his job." Another, "But when a female does it," another, "it's like, yeah, why are you in such a bad fucking mood today?" Another, "Why are you such a bitch? When we're aggressive, it's looked down on as if we're aggressive. We're bitches, we're rude and not nice. But if a male were to do it, he's just being a boy, or he's just being a boss. He's excelling in his career. But when women do it, it's not taken the same way. And we have to tread so lightly every day it feels." And then she paused. So this Rage Ground place is completely an amazing outlet. Oh my gosh. Said Pyro, I feel so calm. I feel almost euphoric. I feel like my endorphins are all the way up. Another, yeah, I'm really happy right now. Pyro, I've broken my phone a couple times, and especially in high school. She kind of trailed off. And then Pyro's cousin. She would also set things on fire. She's my little cousin, and she's a pyro. And any birthday or anything, she's like, let me light the candles. And she'd just like to set shit on fire. Pyro. It's 10 years later, I've obviously got the fire thing under control. But when my parents moved out of their house that we grew up in, I had all of these posters on the wall, which I hung myself. And my dad was upset because when he moved them, he's like, are you fucking kidding me? There are all these holes in the wall. What's that from? And she said, well, that's from my phone, that's from a lamp, that's from my fist. Another in the group said the rage room reminded her of the book Schoolgirls by Peggy Orenstein. Quote, it's basically a book about girls when they're going through their adolescence, how they're treated different in school, and how it shapes the way that they feel about themselves. The negative body images and the ways they act out versus boys. If a boy is rambunctious in class and talks out of turn, he's the class clown, he's funny. When a girl does it, she's disobedient. And so, girls become less and less outgoing. They raise their hands less in class, they answer questions less in class, and they don't get as good grades. It's a decline as they progress through schooling. The primatologist Franz de Waal, author of Chimpanzee Politics and Our Inner Ape, told me, I interviewed him about the rage room, told me that it is very common for socially marginalized primates to displace aggression. Quote, if primates are tense or lose a fight or are frustrated, they take it out on some easy target. It seems like the rage room is a sort of extension of that. A classic example in the arts of rage gone awry is the poet Marianne Moore's 5-decade-long revision of her famous poem Poetry down to just 3 lines. So these are the 3 lines. I, too, dislike it. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. There was a backlash when she published this revised version in 1967 because she had cribbed it from her own poem, published many, many decades later, that was originally 32 lines in length. Her fans cried that she went too far and that she had ruined her own art. The poet Robert Pinsky wrote in Slate of the debate, quote, many readers, including numbers of Moore's fellow poets, consider this to be one of the worst and most egregious examples ever of a terrible revision. Moore had in effect declared war on poetry. I asked Robert Pinsky, when I interviewed him, about what the perfect edit was. And Pinsky was coy, responding with a story about the jazz great Miles Davis. Quote, there's a drummer, and Miles Davis is trying to get the drummer to play slower. He wants the tempo slower, and so he says, like this, and. But the drummer won't do it. And so Miles Davis goes, okay, let me give it to you, and. But the drummer, for some reason, still can't do it. And finally, Davis says, okay, let me give it to you. I spoke with Heather White, who edited Marianne Moore's work for a recent collection of poetry. Heather White told me that in her opinion, what Marianne Moore was doing was attempting to get rid of the extraneous complexities from her early poems. This is why she reduced it down to just 3 lines. Always by removing, she said, never by adding. If you're not sure if something works, said White, the most expedient cure is usually just to delete it. I asked, how do you know when to stop? White said, quote, I think by the time Marianne Moore was in her 60s, which was when she was doing her major edition of her early work, she basically couldn't read her younger self anymore. She was about as confused by her own poems as other people were. So she went back, and I think her mind was just sort of getting rid of complexities that didn't add anything, that just confused and obfuscated what she wanted to say. Basically, Moore had changed her mind about what she wanted her own poetry to do. Partly, says White, that was because World War II happened, and a lot of people changed their mind about what art should accomplish. For my money, says White, that was a huge mistake, since I think a lot of the value is in those complexities and those strangenesses, and those weird associative paths her mind took. The whole point was the path to getting there. You couldn't go back and get rid of what was extraneous without destroying the whole experience. She thought that they were simplified. She thought that they were purged of enigmas that engaged her more than the clarities that replaced them. Said White, "I always felt like I was insisting on my right to be baffled. It wasn't necessary to me that I understood every line, and I resented a lot, actually, when the things which puzzled me were removed." She mentioned Marion Moore's brother and the impact he had on her editing. Quote, "Marion Moore was very close to both her mother and her brother, and her brother, who was not particularly literary, read everything that she wrote and gave her advice. She gave him some piece of writing, I don't remember which, and he responded that she should, quote, starve it down and make it run. This stayed with her. She also starved herself, of course, not because she cared how she looked, but for sort of related psychological reasons. So let's just say compression and concision and contraction were all very, very big with her. The conclusion White was making, obvious in retrospect, was that Marion Moore had starved herself and her poems for similar reasons. Quote, "She didn't have what we would call body image issues now, but she lived with her mother her whole adult life until her mother died in 1947. So Moore was probably about 60 and her mother was in her 80s. And when I say they lived together, they shared a bed for 20 years. It was insane, it was not good. And during that time, her response to any kind of stress was just to stop eating. There are endless family letters about how Marion Moore is not eating. Her weight dropped, and at one point she was like 80 pounds or something. At the same time, her mother's idea of a good meal was prunes and onions. There was just something very, very strange about food and eating in that household. Moore, as far as anybody knows, had no romantic or sexual relationship of any kind. It seems pretty clear that that's largely because her mother, having lost her son to marriage, painfully and not gracefully, essentially decided that she wasn't going to lose her daughter the same way. Moore acceded to this demand. And it may well be that part of the weight thing was, the anorexic's trick of keeping the body childlike by keeping it underweight. In 1949, 2 years after the death of Moore's mother, the Nobel Prize Committee awarded Edas Moniz, the inventor of the lobotomy, a Nobel Prize in physiology. In the award ceremony speech, they wrote that the lobotomy could treat, quote, aggressiveness and the like. They later listed as one of the benefits of the lobotomy, quote, the nursing problem will be much simplified by the fact that the patient, after operation, can be kept in a quiet ward. If you're wondering whether it was a coincidence that the lobotomy was heralded so greatly by the world's premier grantees a mere 4 years after the end of World War II as a cure for rage and anger, I can assure you it is no coincidence. In 1976, male prisoners aged 16 to 34 at the Medium Security Correctional Institution at Cheshire, Connecticut, were selected for a study on aggression. They had to meet the following criteria. 1, conviction for serious aggressive crimes, for example, manslaughter, murder, rape, or assault. 2, a history of chronic assaultive behavior and or a history of chronic impulsive antisocial behavior. For $3.75 per week, they received either a placebo or a solution of lithium carbonate derived from lithium deposits such as the one right outside this window. Major infractions per month decreased to 0 at the end of 4 months, after which they rebounded higher relative to the group who had been injected with the placebo the whole time. In 2002, there's a study that looked at the word frequency in the published poems from a group of about 20 poets, 10 of whom had committed suicide and 10 of whom had not. They found only one word more frequent in the group of poets who had ended up killing themselves. The word was I. Franz de Waal could think of no examples of a primate in the wilds targeting inanimate objects with their anger, like occurred in the rage room. Usually, if primate number 2 in the hierarchy was aggrieved by primate number 1, it was another, number 3, say, or some lower primate that took the brunt of it. The inanimate part and the self-harm part seems uniquely Homo sapien. A bit later, de Waal came back to this point but changed his mind slightly. I've seen situations where, he said, instead of using a scapegoat, monkeys would run through the water basin and stare at and threaten their own reflections. But this wasn't why we might think. They would likely not recognize themselves. No monkey has ever passed the, quote, mirror test for self-recognition, but rather because they see the reflection as an easily threatened and submissive individual who never seems to fight back. Interestingly, at Rageground, one of the women I interviewed, who used to be a therapist, had said that the mirror was her favorite object to smash, not because she didn't recognize herself in it, but rather precisely because she did. Lithium, lobotomy, starving, manners, rage rooms, these are ways in which we edit. Quote, if you're not sure if something works, the most expedient cure is just to delete it. Anyone over age 24 in this room has parts of themselves made in the 20th century. If you are under 24, you have no materials inside you from the prior century. It's true, Eric. If nonetheless you wonder sometimes whether you must inherit the anger and rage of that prior century, or say if you worry about inheriting the anger of your parents or your country, or say you worry about the perseverance of anger directed at yourself from this morning or right now, remember, those emotions were made of a different material. They cannot be remade. The impossible hat cannot be made. Neither should any of us feel trapped to repeat an emotion from a mire of expired circumstance. There are 5 stages of grief. If you listened to most of the words in this speech, you might think that this was about the second one. But if you listened instead to just these last 3 lines, you'd realize that it was in fact about the 5th. The end. I know that does not dispose to questions very well.
What is the 5th stage of grief?
Acceptance.
Acceptance.
Number 2 is anger. Number 2 is anger. 5th is acceptance. Yeah.
Did you go in the rage room?
Oh yeah, I did go in the rage room.
How was it?
I loved it. There was a very odd thing where when I was a child, I had a bicycle in middle school, and a girl, had jumped on it at the public library, and she broke it. The frame broke in half. And my mother, so I recall this, so the bike, it was $25 to replace this bike. It was like one of those like huffy kind of faux mountain bikes, right? And my mother at the time really couldn't afford $25 for a new bike, so she calls up this girl's father and says, you owe us $25, you owe us a new bike. He found this absurd. The next day when I go to school, and for the following week, I got mocked mercilessly because, you know, my mother had like gotten extrajudicial and tried to get the $25 back for this dumbass bike, right? So I had a friend who had been broken up with by her fiance, and she was weeping in Los Angeles over on the west side, and I said, come downtown, we'll go to the rage room. I had never gone. So she goes in and she's just smashing the hell out of everything symbolically related to their relationship. Because you could do 2 things. One, you can purchase objects that they have already there, kind of like warehouse, like kind of leftover things that they've taken from construction sites and abandoned buildings. Or you can bring your own things and destroy them in the room. And you have to pay a small surcharge depending on, I believe it's just not the emotional size of the object, but actually the physical size of the object. But they had a small bike there. And I said I would like to add that small bike to the room. And the man said, okay, the guy who ran the rage room, he was like, okay, that's fine, that'll be $5 to add that. And I said, no, this is really important, you don't understand. I have to pay $25 to put this bike in this room and destroy it. And I did, and it was lovely.
As a filmmaker, I always wondered why director's cuts are always longer when usually when you edit something, as you said, to the essence, it should be shorter. And I always thought, like, I want to be the first director who has the director's cut 20 fewer minutes, like instead of additional minutes that were never seen before.
Yeah, there's some writer at some point wrote a letter saying I would have made this letter shorter if I had had more time. Bertrand Russell. Okay, thank you.
Or Mark Twain, I think.
Chloe and Dylan, can you ask
Dylan.
Alternating words?
I don't share a brain with her.
Not today. Are you anti-editing, Patrick?
Ha!
Am I anti-editing? Yeah, so what I find interesting is kind of this idea that clearly we edit out of some direction toward maybe aesthetic beauty or some just compulsive need that we have. But there's also like, it seems that often the way that we treat mental health, often the way that we treat behavioral aberrance, often the way that we treat aggression is, is to over-edit. Manners, if you look at these old school books on manners, right? And what it means to be ladylike or a woman or these things, it's mostly a restriction of behavior. It's mostly editing. You're mostly taking a fully formed person and trying to chop them down into 3 lines of too little poetry. And what seems clear is that Marianne Moore, when she edited hers down to 3 lines, it was an aggressive act against poetry itself. Because the final version, the drafts she had were hundreds of beautiful lines of prose and poetry, right? They're just almost objectively better. And yeah, she was one of the few that made the director's cut, like much smaller.
Dylan.
No, you mentioned the mirror test in passing and let it go. And now that cameras are cheap and in the wild everywhere, we're seeing cool wild animals playing with mirrors in different ways. And I'm just curious if you want to expound on the protocol that the experimentalist used to say that monkeys don't pass and how that jives with all the Twitter videos I've seen.
Do you mean if in the sentence I kept short and brief on purpose, I should insert many methodological details into it? Yeah. So the mirror self-recognition test is quite beautiful and interesting. It's like basically if you put a mark on you as the individual or the subject or the monkey you're testing or whatever you're trying to test and put them in front of a mirror, the kind of question is, will they ever, and also how quickly, and if you care about certain other methodologies, like do they immediately understand that the dot is on them or on the kind of like fictional creature in the mirror, right? So like often social animals have a grooming instinct. And so if one of their kind of compatriots has a dot on them, they'll go and try to fix it on the mirror version. But if they recognize this themselves, they'll like scratch the back of their head wherever the dot is. And it's this kind of like highly controversial test over time because the results have to be interpreted by a person who can pass the test. But in general, it seems to be like not too many species can pass it. Last I checked, like half of chimps could. No monkey had ever passed it. People argue about whether or not certain bird species, there's only one, the pika pika, which pair bonds for life, which is not a coincidence, can pass it. Various different cetaceans can or cannot, but it's really awkward when you're testing them in like a SeaWorld tank. So that's the test.
Eric, did you raise your hand?
No.
Oh no.
I did.
You did. Elizabeth.
Yeah, same. Brilliant, as of course I would always expect from you. No expectations, just wow. So my head is exploding with all these different ideas and questions, and I'm just gonna throw some stuff out there about what I saw, and you'll have something to respond probably. So this thread of deleting and how do you know if you're gonna go too far or not? And this question of leaning into anything, and how do you know if you're gonna be able to stop? So I heard that in the rage room, like what if someone gets in like a rage fit and then they don't stop? And in the deleting, in the poetry, like if you go too far, then all of this sort of feeling of going all in is a leap into the unknown, which is the creative act itself. All creative acts are leaping into the unknown. And I don't know what my question is around this, but it's like bugging me so much. And was like, there is something here to going all in, and then the fear of what if I flip into some other thing that I just keep rolling and rolling and rolling and can't get out of, whether it's in a creative act or a rage room.
I mean, the lobotomy itself is a like physical editing of a brain, right? You're literally getting in there and like removing tissue. And what became very clear very quickly, and they don't retract Nobel Prizes, but what became very clear very quickly was that like the neurosurgical editors of these people's lives and thoughts often would go too far. And yeah, I don't really have So the thing I find most interesting about the Rage Room is that, like, presumably the clientele is not mostly men, because men can like fight on the sidewalk, kind of like with a little bit more kind of social propriety, right? And so what I find really interesting is this allowance that this room provides of a structure to be yourself. You have to pay to be yourself. You have to pay to express this kind of rage. And if you think about the kinds of things, let's imagine the incorporated businesses that men often use to pay, right? And compare it to perhaps like this Rage Room version. There's this interesting thing where we have the full expression of the human need and form, and then we must kind of transact in order to do it in a safe confine of a small room. So I wonder, like, were we to be given the structural capacity to be exactly who we wanted to be, what that would look like in all of the forms, all of the emotions, right? Not just anger, not just rage.
And there wouldn't maybe be the fear of going too far because you have already expressed it in a balanced way.
Well, because then there is no too far, because in some sense nobody's
Exactly.
watching, right? Yeah, who's watching?
Anna.
Given the premise of eternal sunshine in the spotless mind, where you're able to edit or delete your memories, I wonder how you feel if that were to become reality and people could delete or edit their memories. How would that fit into society, and what do you think would happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is mostly why I don't talk to 20-year-olds, because they're mostly blacked out. They're mostly not going to remember by the time they're my age anything that kind of happened to them that year, you know? So there's a kind of functional, natural way in which our memories are deleted. And we've just taken the natural rate of this as an acceptable and normal thing. So I wouldn't actually say the Eternal Sunshine kind of fictional thought experiment actually goes one step far enough to be interesting. I actually find it bizarre that we accept and take for granted how little of our lives we end up ultimately remembering, and how yet we still function in the present as if we're remembering this or plan to. Even I, relative to, I have no idea why perhaps people that are much older than me talk to me, because if you define being blacked out as kind of functionally not remembering 99% of your experience, at some point I won't remember 99% of maybe even this day, right? And it's not tomorrow, but it will be 40, 50 years from now. So at what time horizon am I kind of functionally blacked out in that way? So I actually think there's less worry about that question than there should be in society, because we're all just acting like this is totally normal.
Yeah.
Yeah, what time horizons do you think there are of being blacked out on our memories? It's not a day, it's shorter than 50 years. What's your observation?
So question being the kind of time horizons at which memories kind of disappear.
Yeah.
It's very categorically and functionally related, right? I mean, I am of the opinion that there are parts of your brain that are keeping track of everything that's ever happened to you, but those are not always consciously accessible. So for example, the very premise that you could say start to play chess today and get better over time, just literally get better over time, you start to see the board slightly differently, and you could fill in chess with literally any activity, social, athletic, cognitive, intellectual, anything. By the very nature of our ability to get better over time, that means that something is changing every single day. Something is changing, which means you are different, which means some part of your brain did remember that. And there are, even if it's just fire spinning or whatever it is, if you can get better at it over time, that means some part of your brain is actually remembering the essential features of it. But most of that is gone to our consciously accessible parts, right? You just get better, but you don't know why you get better. One of the worst things to do is to ask an expert at a field why they're good at what they do, because they've completely lost the ability to actually understand why they're good at the thing that they do. They'll give you some answer, of course, but that'll be some confabulated kind of post hoc thing that isn't probably real.